today's World Insight with Tian Wei. Trump visits London. How will he and outgoing Prime Minister Theresa May strengthen transatlantic ties? And Brigham Young University students putting on shows for Chinese audiences. We'll take you up close right after this break.
And welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you on CGTN from Beijing. Britain is rolling out the red carpet for U.S. President Donald Trump. His three-day state visit will involve meeting the Queen, Prime Minister Theresa May, and a ceremony in the Portsmouth to mark the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landing. The White House previously hailed the visit as an opportunity to reaffirm the steadfast relationship between the two countries, but unlike former U.S. President Barack Obama, Mr. Trump has not been asked to address the Houses of Parliament. So what does this mean? How will the meeting affect Britain's political future at a critical time when Mrs. May just announced her resignation? And what does this mean for Washington? Will the traditional ally still there?
Protesters turned out in their thousands the last time the US president visited Britain. Something similar anticipated by critics this time round, with even the Trump blimp taking to the air once again. As the president's travels rarely touched the ground on his 2018 stopover, it's thought he missed most of that. While he is said to have loved Britain's famous pomp and ceremony, they expect government ministers to be on the edge of their seats nonetheless.
He's a controversialist. He's unorthodox, and so he has some virulent opponents. He's also got some supporters. And of course, the affection for the United States as a country transcends the fact that it is just the president who is coming.
Already, the president has taken sides in Britain's election for a new leader once Prime Minister Theresa May leaves Downing Street next Friday, talking up Brexit hardliner Nigel Farage and the lead candidate for the Prime Minister's position, former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson.
Nigel Farage is a friend of mine. Boris is a friend of mine. They're two very good guys, very interesting people.
Pressing Britain on its relationship with Huawei could be another controversy. The British considering the Chinese communications giant for a non-core role in its plans for 5G, and President Trump banning it in the US as a security risk.
So what's the word on Mr. Trump's visit to the UK? We are joined by Professor Ian Beck in London. He's a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Darendorf Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Washington, D.C., we invited Ivan Eland, a senior fellow at the director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Last but not least, in our Beijing studio, Cui Hongjian, the director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Professor Beck, I want to go to you first. What is the real essence of this visit by President Trump? How much do you think London would welcome all those suggestions and gestures?
Well, I think it's a full state visit, which is a different phenomenon from the one that Trump had a couple of years ago when he was just on an ordinary visit to the UK. This will be all the pomp of a president meeting Britain's head of state, the Queen being welcomed at Buckingham Palace and so on. I think it's worth stressing as well that such visits once in a presidency might be becoming relatively normal. It's a time at which they'll discuss major issues of international concern, security, trade developments, maybe even reflecting on the way in which the relationship between the UK and the US evolve after Brexit.
Therefore, many people would ask that question, Mr. Eland, really how much can be achieved as a result of all the changes mentioned by Professor Beck? After all, these are only a few days before the Prime Minister goes away.
Yes, well, she is a lame duck, so she has basically very little power, and so they can discuss these things, and I'm sure that there'll be some productive discussions, but she is hampered by that. And you know, we also have the possibility that Britain may stumble out of the EU with no agreement. So that will increase their dependence on trade deals with the U.S. And I'm sure that, given Trump's view of allies mooching off the U.S. And taking advantage of our security umbrella but not giving us much back, he will use his negotiating leverage to get more out of the UK, because they'll be desperate to get foreign trade deals. Of course, Britain will also be more desperate to negotiate with China. Brexit, stumbling out of Brexit or getting out of Brexit is, I think, going to raise more conflict than it will solve.
Professor Begg, what about that? I mean, UK now at its critical juncture of its own, which is facing the prospect of Brexit. Meanwhile, Britain wants to play both hands. At least that was the original thought. You know, both have links to China and also to the United States. Well, the transatlantic partnership and allies nature have also been evolving. So, Professor Begg, how well will Britain be able to balance all of these latest developments?
Well, Britain's in a mess because of the disarray around Brexit. I don't think, in spite of everything you read and hear about in the British political system, there will be no deal with the European Union. That's mentioned repeatedly, but there's still a majority in the House of Commons to oppose it, and that majority will, in my judgment, prevail. That said, the UK will be looking around the rest of the world saying, where can we do business in future? The US is already Britain's biggest trading partner. And although Trump has dangled the possibility of a new trade deal with the UK, I doubt there is that much more intensity to that trade deal that can substitute for leaving the European Union. On the other hand, Britain trades relatively little with China and sees China and other emerging markets in East Asia as being the opportunity of Brexit. There's still the residual question of whether Brexit happens as currently planned. That always is going to hang over these discussions. But Britain will be looking round the rest of the world trying to improve its position.
Mr. Cui, of course, there are several layers going on right here. China always wants to have a very united Europe because China wants to deal with the potential of a regionalized Europe, while at the same time developing ties with the individual countries. But at the same time now, China-U.S. trade negotiations, as Mr. Eland beautifully put. So how much do you think China is looking at this visit?
I think it will be more symbolic event, also, you know, because of the situation of Prime Minister May, and also because of the Brexit. Because we know one of the big questions raised from the Brexit towards the transatlantic relations, especially the UK-US relations, is UK is losing its special function as a bridge between the Atlantic Sea. But of course, I think from China's perspective, to have some more trade and have some more economic cooperation with the UK, no matter Brexit or not, I think it will be a very, very big concern. But of course, regarding to the trade issue, I think so far China tried to also cooperate with UK and the European countries more and more, and to uphold the kind of a multilateral cooperation will be a very, very important principle for the trade itself.
Professor Begg, you know, one of the pillars of the British diplomacy, at least since the Second World War, has a lot to do with its ally relationship with the United States. Even at very challenging and, shall we say, controversial times, for example, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, which, of course, the Prime Minister then suffered a lot, eventually in his so-called political legacy. So, Professor Begg, how much do you think the politicians now in the UK will reflect upon the real nature of the relationship now? Particularly, you have a generation of politicians in which, you know, looking inward seems to be bigger of a trend than it used to be, even though it is still not the majority.
Well, I think you're right to identify this dilemma for British politics, which has been there since even before the Second World War. The transatlantic relationship has been one of the key pillars of British diplomacy, British international relations. And I think it's maybe worth making the point that it's often a mistake to say Trump equals the United States. There are far deeper ties than just with the Trump administration, which Britain will be keen to nurture in future. They include the security establishment, which, as we know, has been very often at odds with what Trump has been trying to do globally. So that is a central pillar of British diplomacy. But Britain also has to reflect the fact that it's geographically close to Europe. The gravitational pull of Europe, both in economic terms and in diplomatic and other terms, is not going to go away as a significant element in the British attitude to the world. So riding that horse in two directions is going to be a very difficult task, especially with the confusion around Brexit.
Mr. Cui, do you think President Trump, obviously he's making the trip to the UK now, in a way to show that he will have an influence on the very influential European country as he sees it, and to even a certain extent to divide and conquer in a way when it comes to how the European capitals are making their decisions. While at the same time, one shouldn't dismiss the fact that there might be a tempting gesture to surprise or to impress China, that Washington and London could also walk very close despite of the latest shall I say, exchange of rhetorics and the words between the two capitals. So what do you think, Professor? How will these kind of gestures be able to put the two countries together? Whether so-called ideology, but ideology about what? Will bring these two capitals together or apart?
Yes, certainly. I think this time the visit by Mr. Trump to London, there will be also a requirement from Washington towards the London is to show, just like you mentioned, that still Mr. Trump could find a destination in Europe, because we know after Mr. Trump had worse and worse relations with Chancellor Merkel, with President Macron, so now it's difficult even for the Mr. Trump to find that a destination of visit in European, I mean, especially continental Europe. So I think it's important for Washington to show the world that, okay, we do have allies in Europe. But of course, I agree with the American guest that perhaps China will become one of the issues for this visit by Mr. Trump. And not only because of the trade, but of course now I think the problem for Britain is Britain tried to reshape its diplomatic policy and its global vision. One of the most important things that Britain wants to develop its trade relations, investment with China, both with the United States.
Yeah.
But now the question is, once the UK and the US still has some, common grounds or common value, but I doubt that what it is.
Because it seems that you're confirming my question, which is there is a question over there. Let's go to Professor Beck over there. Exactly. Is there an answer to these questions?
Well, Britain is casting around. Where does it go in future? And it's also worth recalling that the initial reason for Trump coming on the state visit was associated with something that's just a couple of days away, which is the celebration or the marking of the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy, which was, after all, one of the most extreme examples of US collaboration with the UK in fighting the tyranny of Nazi Germany. So it's that context which provides some of the pretext for the negotiations or discussions that are going to take place. Britain looking to say, are we going back 75 years and moving forward for the next 75 years of collaboration? I don't think it's deeply ideological the way it's going. It's much more about ceremony and trying to get the social relations between the potential new British leadership and the US administration, as well as thinking how do the dominoes fall?
Yeah, let me just put it in a very blunt way, Professor Beck. You're very good at answering my blunt questions. For example, What is the
I'll
biggest British national interest when it comes to trade and economic ties? What does London want to achieve despite of all these turmoil in the internal politics? You do want to have a better economy so that there will be less crisis back at home. So what are the biggest national interests, Professor Begg, and who are here to build those interests for the best partners? I'm not let you to choose between China and the United States. I'm just trying to get an honest answer from a British perspective, Professor Begg.
I think it's very straightforward. The initiatives, the incentives are to create an environment in which the British economy can prosper. If Britain is fully outside the EU, whatever deal emerges as a result of that, then it has to look to other parts of the world to recreate alternative relationships. It's concerned about where investment's coming from. It's concerned about its engagement in technology networks and being able to deal with the challenges of everything from climate change to the terrorist threats that are coming from different parts of the world. So all of these things go into this, rather, I think, than any explicit ideology.
Mr. Eland, on those notes given by our British professor, any of those are shared by Washington now, particularly by the current administration?
Well, I think, you know, they're just waiting to see what internal developments happen in Britain, whether you do get an agreement or whether there's no agreement with the EU. And I think Britain is going to be in a vulnerable position either way. It's going to be more vulnerable if it doesn't get an agreement, but even if it does get an agreement, I think you know, Britain is going to be casting around for other relationships, and I'm sure that Donald Trump is going to use that. He plays hardball, as the Chinese know, on these trade agreements. Now, whether he's competent enough to win in doing that is another story, but that's what he does. And so I think also there's going to be a lot of tension with Britain over China if Britain really does want to open up more trade relations with China, which it seems to, and I think which is going to have to. So I think that's going to be a major contention. Of course, you also have the problem that the British and the U.S. have been at odds over the climate change agreement, the U.S. withdrawal from that, the Middle East peace process, and most importantly, I think, the Iran nuclear deal, which was a mistake by the U.S. to get out of that. But it's still a sore spot. Those three areas also are contentious between the U.S. and Britain. And of course, you know, you'll see smiles at this state visit, and it's all well and good to have cannons going off and people in military uniforms marching around. The pageantry will certainly be great, but the underlying problem is that you know, the British system is in turmoil, and I would argue so is the American system to some extent. So, you know,
it's almost like a competition, if I could help you to conclude that a competition of who's more vulnerable. Professor Cui, also in Beijing, you see hardball being played. You see so-called sharp power being exercised and exerted. And now there's a competition about who is the most vulnerable, who will blink first and blink on what price. So, Mr. Cui, from the topic today toward you know, international trade, toward the multilateral frameworks on different areas, what are you looking at for this specific trip? What kinds of hints will it eventually give us?
I believe that this visit, indeed, there will be, I mean, few practical, I mean, outcomes or some so-called achievements.
Okay.
Because so far you can find less and less, I mean, common grounds or common stands between Britain and the United States. Maybe now, yes, there are some requirement with each other, just like we mentioned before that the FTA agreement after the Brexit will be the biggest requirement so far from London to Washington, and also to show a kind of alliance so far, especially in the current situation from Washington will be a biggest requirement. But now I think for a long-term situation, not only because of the Brexit, and also not only because of the so-called unilateral behaviors by Washington. I think now it's time for Britain and the U.S. to rethink and to reshape their relationship.
Well, you think, well, we'll see whether they think or not. Before we go, very briefly from our two guests, Professor Beck, final words.
Well, a final word is that Trump in some ways is quite childish. He probably thinks it's great that he should be visiting the Queen because his mother was a great fan of the Queen. He likes to present his family to the Queen. So I would read less into the political significance of this visit than the pageantry.
I see. Well, Mr. Eland, final words.
Yeah, I would agree with that to some extent. I think that the British government is a lame duck, and we don't know what's going to happen with Brexit. So the relationship, the actual relationship, other than the pageantry, is sort of on hold until we see what goes on. But I think the U.S. probably has a stronger hand than Britain does, because Britain's policy is in utter turmoil with the EU, and that seems to be driving everything in British politics at the current time.
Ivan Eland, Ian Begg, Cui Hongjian, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, a song of fire and ice with Brigham Young University students putting on shows for Chinese audiences once again after 4 decades of friendly exchanges. We'll take you up close right after this break.
As the current U.S. administration plays up protectionism against global consensus, China-U.S. ties are under the greatest strain. On Sunday, China released a white paper on China's stance on China-U.S. trade talks, which points out that the U.S. government has backtracked on its commitments in the China-U.S. trade negotiations and should bear the sole and entire responsibility for the stalled talks. On Monday, China's Ministry of Education issued an alert for studying abroad, saying some students suffered visa restrictions from the U.S. However, many in America remain clear-headed. On Monday, the U.S.-based Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or IEEE, reversed its restrictions on Chinese company Huawei and its 68 affiliates. In times of political uncertainty, it's important that the people-to-people exchanges between the two countries power on.
It was in 1979 when China and the U.S. went full steam ahead with diplomatic ties. That same year, a group of college students from Brigham Young University became one of the first American entertainers to perform in China. For Chinese audiences then, it was something new and exciting. And for the young American performers, China was completely exotic and fascinating. Since then, the Utah Private University had done more than 30 tours in China, making a name for itself among the Chinese. This year, to celebrate the 4 decades of ties and friendship, the university brought its largest show yet to the stage in Beijing. It has more than 200 students performing and participating in cultural exchange programs in Beijing, Shanghai, Xi'an, and many other cities. You know, it's not just about the cultural performances in itself, but rather the history that this university has been walking with the Chinese people over the past 4 decades. As a result, I sit down with Kevin Worthen, who is the president of the BYU. We started our conversation from back in 1979 when Mr. Worthen was still a BYU student himself, who heard about the tour to China from his friends on campus. What was it like, the very first performance of Brigham Young in China at Hong Ta Theater in downtown Beijing?
Well, I was not present at that time.
I know, you were very young at the time.
Actually, I was a student at BYU at the time.
You were?
I was.
Okay.
And I had grown up in an era in which there had been no diplomatic relationships between the People's Republic of China and the United States. So it was quite newsworthy when this group from Brigham Young University had the opportunity to come to Beijing and perform. And it turned out to be one that is remembered very well on campus. Since that time, students hear the stories of the impact that was had. I wondered about those stories myself, how true they were. Over time, some stories get exaggerated.
What were those stories? You're making me really curious.
It was about how students or people in China would see on CCTV looping
Thanks
reruns.
for mentioning our name.
Yes, would see reruns of the performers from BYU early in the early years after they had been here, and how influenced they were to think of one of the great universities of the United States was BYU, was Brigham Young University. And I came to China 3 years ago for my first visit, and I visited with various people who were about my age or a little bit younger. Many of them confirmed the stories that they too had this image of Brigham Young University and of the United States because of the group that had come here.
1970s, the end of the 1970s, when the Chinese, almost all of them either in blue or in green or on bicycles, watched this performance of girls being thrown around in the air, you know, singing a very different way coming from the U.S., so different from the revolutionary songs. Have you ever imagined what it was like for the Chinese? I'm sure when the students coming back from China, they must have been talking.
Well, the one thing that I heard mostly was how warmly received they were by the people, who again spoke a different language, come from a different culture, at the time viewed for many of their lifetimes as almost not only foreigner but enemies, so to speak, and that they were not that different than people may have thought from what we were.
I know your students have been not only performing, but also they're enjoying themselves a little bit in Beijing. Probably they're going to talk about it as you are talking to me right now, 3 decades later. What have they told you so far? Do they really talk to you?
They do. Yeah, they may be more reserved with me than they are with other people. My guess is for many of them, for most of them, this will be the single biggest event during their university years. The thing that not only they remember, but that actually shapes them in many ways, that's transformative in terms of how they view the world, how they view the things they've been studying. And again, seeing the common humanity that people share and the enthusiasm they feel from people around them.
And now I'm with 4 of them coming from Brigham Young University dancing and singing troupe.
I'm Skylar Hunter. I'm from California. So I'm on the dunk team, the basketball dunking acrobatic team.
My name is Abby Bench. I am from Utah. I'm on the Cougarettes, which is the dance team at Brigham Young University. I'm Hannah Dally, and from Utah, studying music dance theater. Every waking moment, turn my head with talk of summertime. Sing near me with you here beside you. Promise me that all you say is true. That's all I ask of you.
My name is Jansen Dally. We're actually married.
Yes. Oh, are you?
We are.
Oh,
yeah.
really? Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. I'm on vocal point, so we're an 8-man a cappella group.
I heard you've been traveling around China, starting from Beijing.
Yes, yes. We love the Great Wall. It was beautiful.
When you are coming into a country different from yours, how did your parents and friends see this?
They were thrilled. They couldn't be more proud.
My parents, I think, are excited and a little bit jealous that we're here in China. Not only with all of the sightseeing we've been able to do, but with our show as well, and even just walking the streets of Beijing and meeting people, dancing on the streets and the festival that's going. Yeah, we were dancing with some of the locals out here that we just met walking around, and it's been great to connect our cultures. And so we were in the park. There was one, they were doing this, and we came here, and went back around, and up. It was just great. They're just so willing to teach us, and they're excited to see us, and we're excited to learn their dancing, I guess their post-supper dancing. So.
But, you know, there are so many things going on between China and the United States, in the media, you know, in politics. And therefore, people see your performance here in China with an extra layer of significance. Do you also see it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a lot of things going on, but mostly what we want to do is just show people that, you know, we're all connected and that we all have things in common. And there's no better way to do that than, in my opinion, than through music and through dance. And so that's really our goal. And we've just loved going out on the streets and meeting the Chinese people. And we haven't performed for an audience yet, but we're excited to make the connection in that way as well. So.
I'm really looking forward to your performance.
Thank you.
All the best.
As well.
All the best. You think about it, President Worthen, you know, Brigham Young University coming from the state of Utah, this almost has nothing to do with politics in a way, and also so far away, just to look at the name of the state, from China. But how come it was one of the really real pioneers in linking the two people together? Very important bridge.
I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is there is a shared value system in terms of the importance of education, the importance of families, and that's something that people in Utah and at Brigham Young University, those two things are deeply part of the culture. The other is within, again, the culture of the university and its sponsoring organization, a deep-seated commitment to the cultural arts, music, dance. The early pioneers who arrived in Utah, when they were barely surviving, just eking out a living, quickly built what were called cultural halls. And even though they were just trying to make a living, it was important for them to have music and culture, even in the early years that they were there in Utah.
You emphasize once and again, President Worthen, about common humanity from the very beginning of our conversation. But now, as you may know, there are a lot of people talking about maybe we should go first, our interests, while others, we'll just see. Of course, there are very different views from around the world about this. What do you make of it? When you were interacting with the students as an educator, what kind of picture are you trying to present to them? And what kind of picture do you think is in their best interests?
Well, I think that their best interests are served by understanding what we believe as a people, as a university, as I say, as our sponsoring church, that each human being is literally created in the image of our heavenly parents. And that each human being has the potential then for it that is much beyond what most people think. And that while each of us has our own particular flaws, each also has within us the ability to do extraordinary things. And that's how they should view people, wherever they're at in their station in life, whatever the situation of the people. That's why I do emphasize the common humanity, to say we are all not only have things in common, but have great potential, greater potential than most of us realize.
You're a constitutional lawyer. Of course, you look at things from a different perspective, but now you are president of Brigham Young. culture exchanges is an important part of Brigham Young University in tradition. So what do you make of this very different tracks of thinking? How things are being put into perspective? How far are we from the real pictures?
It's a really good question, and one that's probably always timely to ask, because context shifts, political winds shift, there's sometimes tension, sometimes agreement, and I think part of the thing that I've seen in law, the study of law, is how temporary law and politics are in many ways. That people's common humanity and relationships can endure even though there are tensions, even though there are disagreements. And those get resolved in various ways, legally and politically and in other ways. But there is, again, a common bond of humanity and relationships that can endure even beyond and during those times when it may be more in tension.
I saw you were sitting in the audience when the rehearsal was taking place. I saw you, even though you were trying to embed it into the audience. Mr. President, which of those many fascinating programs that you put on the stage do you think is the best message to the Chinese?
I suspect, and I don't even know the background of it, but the song they sing at the end in Chinese was very powerful to me. And I don't know the history. I should know what the significance of that song is, but I have a feeling that it probably will be one that the Chinese people resonate with. And I think that for me was probably the most impactful. Otherwise, it's like trying to choose which of my children I like the best, because they're all very good.
You need to be balanced as a president.
Right.
Talking about education, how important is arts and culture? Because as China's economy is also picking up, a lot of parents and schools putting a lot of emphasis on arts and culture education, and yet how to see its potential, that's still a big question mark. What do you think, Mr. President?
I think that it is very much a question, and it's a question in the United States, because many people view education as the principal purpose of education being to prepare you for your first job after college. And for most people, it's not going to be performing, singing, dancing. Even for our students here who are very talented, most of them will not make their living by performing in these arts. But I think in the long run it is most important because it allows people to communicate with each other in a way beyond language. Even when you speak a common language, there's a kind of communication and understanding that happens with arts that elevates our relationship with each other and our understanding of who we are. And I think that's its real power, is to help us understand life in a more complete way.
But as you may know, there's always a balance in the Chinese educational system because of the size of the population, 1.4 billion, therefore tend to be much more competition. Some would argue the college entrance examination is what they call a small bridge that everybody has to cross. It will see which one is more competitive. So a lot of parents are worried about how do they balance the time of the kids, and the kids should also enjoy themselves no matter what they aspire to do. So how do you see that balance?
Well, it is a difficult balance, and there is a need in order to be able to learn the things that need to be learned. There are some who would like to just listen to music all day long.
For example, me, when I was very young.
You were very young. That's
exactly. I'm wondering what I'm saying about you.
But there is some discipline that comes that informs both of those. That is the discipline from being very proficient musically and learning, say, math or languages or something else. There's a common discipline that's required, and if they can see that there's joy attached with that, often with the music and those kind of things, they can sometimes find the joy in mathematics or in science or something else, even though it is something they have to be disciplined in order to work through the time in order to reach the time at which it becomes joyful.
And the other thing, of course, is about, the way of education. Chinese origin, people with Chinese origin are well known for having tiger moms. I'm sure you heard about that in recent years, particularly. But people are debating here in this country about what kind of educational approach to be the best for the kids, including in university. So what do you think, Mr. President?
Well, I think there is a role for universities to help young people realize there are different ways of thinking about things, and different from what they have grown up, to build on the values that they have, but also to add value, in a sense, for experiences they may not have had up until then.
You sound like a constitutional lawyer.
That's,
very abstract.
That's probably not a good, not a good thing either.
It is your way, your
Yeah.
style, I guess. But you know, Mr. President, before we go, there are genuine concerns and worries about two great countries, China and the United States. Where are we going from here? Whether we are leaving a better future and a better potential for the next generation, or this generation gonna fail the next few generations. President Worthen, as an educator, as a constitutional lawyer, as someone who got to know the exotic China for more than 40 years, what do you think?
I'm optimistic about the future.
Really? Where is
Yes.
that optimism based on?
Based on part our past experience, I'll use as one example just what we talked about. If you look at what's happened to both China and Brigham Young University in the last 40 years, it's been remarkable. I don't think either would have predicted, and particularly there's one member of the group here, Randy Booth, who was there in the very beginning in 1979, now here again 40 years later. And to hear him describe the differences in China, it was a much different, just visually, everything else than it was before. And I think that's part of the optimism. But part of it is just, again, the belief in the potential for people to do good and to make wise choices. They don't always do that, and there have been some travesties that have happened. But I think, again, the more people can see the common humanity in each other, I come back to that theme, the more optimistic I am. And programs like this allow that kind of vision, that kind of perspective, to see other people who are different, who speak a different language, come from a different culture, but to see that they share in common, in this case, music and dancing and everything else that is kind of resonates with anyone regardless of their... And that gives me optimism, saying people can still connect at a very deep level, even though the politics around them may be trying to divide them.
Beautifully said, President Worthen. So we are actually almost the time to go into the theaters.
I'm looking forward to it.
Are you nervous about today's performance?
I'm not nervous, no, because they'll do it tremendously well. I don't have to do the performing. I get to enjoy it this
All
time.
you need to do is to be the cheerleader.
That's correct. And that's easy to do.
All right. President Worthen, what a pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight, CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, PM Wei, and to everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insight across China and around the world.